I discovered my husband was planning a divorce long before he thought I ever could, and the moment I found the truth, every corner of my world shifted into a place I had never imagined. But the journey began slowly, like the slow cracking of glass. Under pressure, a sound no one sees coming yet. Once it begins, nothing can stop it from shattering everything in its path. And remember the morning it all started with a strange silence inside our mansion, a silence that wrapped itself around me. Like a warning, the kind you do not fully understand, but you feel it deep enough to pause your breath. Asterisk, my name is Lila, and for 16 years I believed. I lived inside the dream so many admire, a dream built on elegance, trust, and the gentle kind of partnership where two people hold hands and build empires, but behind the golden walls where chandeliers glowed and the soft carpets muted every footstep, something darker had been growing for months, something I had been too loyal to hopeful, too blinded to see, and now that I think back on it, the signs were everywhere, woven into small moments in conversations. Cut short in glances he thought I did not notice, in the sudden coldness that fell between us like winter creeping under a locked door. Asterisk, my husband Marcus was a man who carried charm like a tailored suit. He wore it everywhere he walked, and people bent toward him like flowers seeking sunlight. He knew how to talk, how to command affection, how to build an empire with a single idea, and he had done so again and again until his name became one people whispered with admiration. Sometimes envy, and I had stood by his side through every rise, every struggle, and every victory. And in all those years, I brought my own brilliance to our partnership, a brilliance I never flaunted, yet one that quietly built my $500 million fortune long before he even understood the magnitude of it. Asterisk. But that morning when I found the envelope, everything changed. I had walked into his study, a place I had never needed permission to enter. But recently he had started locking it, and that alone had raised questions in my mind. Questions I swallowed because I wanted to believe he was simply protecting business documents. But the truth was not business, and when he left early that day in an unusual rush, he forgot to lock the door, and something pulled me inside as if my intuition dragged my feet for me. Asterisk, there on the mahogany desk lay a stack of neatly arranged papers with eaters, with a thin silver clip at the top and the words "Draft Divorce Agreement" printed at the center of the first page. And for a moment, everything in me froze, like time itself refused to move, as if even the air around me held its breath. I could not blink. I could not speak. I could not understand, because the man who had kissed my forehead only 2 nights ago, the man who once promised his soul to me, was planning an exit that he had not dared to speak aloud. Asterisk, my heart felt like it rose to my throat and refused to settle, and my hands trembled as I touched the papers, but I forced myself to read every line, and the betrayal kept growing like a shadow, consuming every beam of light inside me. He had planned to claim half of my assets. He had constructed a narrative suggesting I was emotionally unstable, that I was overspending and damaging the reputation of our shared empire, even though the truth was the opposite. He wanted the world to believe I was the problem, the liability, the obstacle in his perfect path. He wanted to paint me as the villain in the story of our life so he could walk away with wealth he had never earned. Asterisk, as I stood there reading the weapon he planned to use against me, a part of me broke, but another part awakened, the part of me that had built my fortune quietly, carefully, strategically, the part of me that knew the world of money better than he ever could, because I had learned early in life that wealth was not just numbers. Wealth was power, security, independence. And I realized in that moment that I had been silent for too long. I had loved too deeply, trusted too openly, and now I had to protect myself with the same strength that had built everything I owned. Asterisk, the next hour passed like a slow burning storm inside my chest, and thoughts kept circling each other like restless birds. I could confront him, I could cry, I could scream, but none of that would change the truth. The only thing that would change the situation was action, and action was something I had always excelled at. So I took a deep breath, gathered every piece of the divorce draft, placed it back exactly as it read, was and walked out silently, knowing the moment he discovered I knew everything, it would already be far too late for him to stop what I would do next. Asterisk. That afternoon, I sat in my private office, the one space Marcus never understood because he believed, okay, I used it only for charity work. But hidden behind its gentle, warm decor was a digital world. He had never seen the world where I tracked my investments, my foundations, my offshore holdings, the companies I built quietly under other names, and the wealth that had grown from millions to hundreds of millions. And as I looked at every account, every number, every asset, knew exactly what I needed to do and how fast I needed to do it because Marcus was smart, but he was not smarter than me, and he certainly was not faster. Asterisk. I called my financial advisor, a man who had been loyal to me since before my marriage, and his voice trembled slightly when he heard the instructions I gave him because he understood the gravity of what I was about to do, and he knew what it meant when I said we move everything now, and not a second later I told him we restructured every asset, every company, every coin in a way no one, not even Marcus, could trace or touch. I told him we shifted jurisdictions, moved ownerships, and built new layers of protection, and each instruction came from a place both cold and clear because betrayal has a way of sharpening the mind with painful precision. Asterisk. Within 3 hours. The first wave of movement had begun within 6 hours. Legal structures had shifted, and within 24 hours, my half-billion fortune belonged to no one Marcus could reach, and by the end of the week, the empire I had built stood higher, stronger, and more protected than it had ever been, and Marcus still had no idea. I knew his secret, nor that I had already rewritten the ending of the story he thought he controlled. And as I watched the final confirmations appear on my screen, I felt a calmness settle inside me, a calmness that came not from revenge, but from reclaiming my power, reclaiming my heartbeat, reclaiming every piece of myself he had tried to manipulate. Asterisk. But the story did not end there, because when Marcus finally began to sense the shift, when he noticed the slight tension in the air, when he felt the faint tremor of something slipping beyond his reach, he tried to act, and that was when everything truly began to unravel in ways neither of us had anticipated. And the week that followed would become the week that changed the course of our lives forever. The week that followed the silent shifting of my fortune began with an uneasy stillness inside our home, a stillness Marcus felt before he understood it. And he moved through the mansion with the restless stride of a man sensing danger without knowing from which direction it approached, and I watched him closely, observing the small cracks in his confidence. The way his steps slowed when he passed my office door, the way his fingers tapped the edge of his phone as if waiting for a message that refused to arrive, and every moment revealed more of the truth. He had hidden from me the truth that he needed my wealth far more than he had ever admitted, even to himself, for years. Marcus had cultivated an image of strength and invincibility, and while some of it was real, much of it was supported by my strategic investments, my silent guidance, and the financial security my fortune provided. But in his arrogance, he had convinced himself he was the mastermind, the backbone, the architect of everything we had built together, and that belief made him careless, blind, and dangerously overconfident, because when a man thinks he cannot fall, he stops paying attention to the cracks forming beneath his feet, and Marcus had stopped paying attention long ago. The third morning after I secured my assets, I walked into the kitchen where the soft sunlight stretched across the counter, and Marcus stood holding his tablet, staring at something with a frown deepening across his face, and though he still looked composed, I saw the flicker in his eyes, the flicker of uncertainty, the silent question. He did not want to speak. He looked up at me and forced a smile, one that did not reach his eyes, and he asked if everything was all right, as if I could not feel the weight of the question behind his voice, but simply nodded because the game had only just begun, and revealing the truth now would end it far too early later. That afternoon, he made phone calls behind closed doors, whispering, urgently trying to mask his worry, but the walls of that house carried sound far better than he realized, and I heard fragments, not enough to expose everything, but enough to confirm what I had suspected. He had financial obligations he had kept. Hidden obligations that were now tightening around him like invisible chains. Obligations he believed he would escape by taking half of my fortune and walking away. Clean, and the knowledge of it hardened something inside me. Not anger, not even sadness, but a clarity sharper than ice, because betrayal is heavy, but understanding it is liberating. The fourth day, my advisor called with another update, and his voice carried a steady confidence, telling me everything had been completed flawlessly, every asset transformed, every company shielded, every account fortified and registered under new entities. I now controlled with absolute authority, and the sound of his voice reaffirmed what I had already known deep inside. I was no longer the woman betrayed. I was the woman who had stepped quietly beyond the reach of a man who thought he could outsmart me. And as I ended the call, I felt a shift inside my chest, a shift from surviving betrayal to taking back control of my narrative. Our cast, however, grew more unsettled as the day unfolded. He paced back and forth across his study, checking his accounts, reviewing documents, making calls that grew more urgent with every hour. And when evening fell, he came to me with a softness he had not shown in months. His voice warm, his smile gentle, as if he suddenly remembered how affection worked. But affection from him now felt like a glove covering a blade, and I met his attempts with calm neutrality, answering his questions with short, thoughtful replies, giving him nothing to read, no expression to interpret, no weakness to exploit. And the more neutral I remained, the more he faltered, because silence reveals truths louder than accusations ever could. Night, as I lay in bed, I heard him on the phone. Again, his voice low, sharp, strained, and though I could not hear every word, I understood enough. He was losing control, his plan was slipping, his confidence cracking, and beneath every phrase, I heard the panic of a man realizing his carefully designed trap had snapped on empty air, and that he was the one now standing inside a tightening circle with no escape, and the darkness of the room felt heavier around me. But instead of fear, I felt strength, a strength born from everything I had endured, from every quiet moment I had chosen to think instead of break. In the fifth day, Marcus asked me to lunch, a rare gesture considering his recent distance, and he chose a quiet restaurant, one known for privacy, as if he wanted to stage a moment of sincerity. And he spoke with a tenderness I had not heard in years, telling me he missed us, telling me he felt disconnected, telling me he wanted to reconnect. But behind his words lay a trembling urgency, the urgency of a man who needed something from me, something he hoped I would not question. And I listened patiently, my expression soft but my mind sharper than ever, because he was not trying to save our marriage. He was trying to save himself, reached across the table and took my hand, gently, as if to anchor the illusion, and he asked vague questions about my businesses, about my accounts, about my recent meetings. Questions he disguised as curiosity, but each one betrayed his desperation, and I responded with a serene calmness, telling him I was focusing on charity work and creative projects. And I watched as confusion flickered in his gaze, because my answers did not match the panic he felt, and he could not understand why nothing in my world seemed disturbed, why nothing had shifted outwardly, even though something massive had shifted inwardly when we returned home. He walked ahead of me into his study and closed the door firmly, and I remained in the hallway for a moment, listening to the muffled frustration in his voice. As he spoke again to someone on the phone, words like urgent and delay and find it echoed faintly through the wooden door, and those words told me exactly what I needed to know. Marcus had expected to see something in my accounts, something he believed he had a right to, something he intended to use against me. But what he found instead was emptiness. Every path he expected to take was now blocked, and every loophole he thought existed had been sealed. An evening I sat in the living room under the soft glow of the chandelier, and I felt an unusual peace, the kind that arrives only when you have embraced the truth with both hands and accepted the fall of something once cherished. And Marcus emerged from his study, his expression calm but his posture tense, and he asked if we could talk. But I told him kindly that I was tired and needed rest, and the look in his eyes shifted from worry to frustration to suspicion because he could not control the pace anymore. He could not control the tone or the direction or the timing. And for a man like Marcus, losing control was the deepest cut of Allen. The sixth day, the first legal ripple reached him because the restructuring of my assets triggered notifications in certain jurisdictions. Notifications he never expected to see, and the shock of it made him pale visibly, his hands tightening around his phone as he read the updates, and though he tried to hide his reaction, I had learned long ago how to read him the way one reads the shifting shape of a storm, and I knew then that his plan was unraveling faster than he could manage, and that soon he would have no choice but to confront the truth. He had kept buried later that night. He stood at the doorway of our bedroom, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway, and in a voice soft but threaded with tension, he asked me directly if I had made any major changes recently, but I looked at him with the calmness of a woman who had walked through fire and found new ground. And I simply said that I had done what I needed to do, and he stared at me long enough to realize that whatever I had done was beyond his reach, beyond his influence, and beyond his ability to undo, and that realization left him shaken in a way I had never seen before. The seventh morning arrived with the quietness of a storm. Right before the thunder breaks, and when Marcus walked into the dining room, the mask he had tried so hard to wear had finally cracked, his shoulders tense, his expression tight, his voice stripped of charm, and for the first time in years I saw him not as the powerful man he pretended to be, but as the fragile man beneath the illusion. A man whose world was slipping from his grasp, and he knew that I knew, and silence sat between us like a blade, and the moment had come when everything would finally be exposed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The seventh morning carried a heaviness that wrapped itself around every breath I took, as if the air itself understood that something irreversible was about to unfold. And when Marcus stepped into the dining room, his movements were clipped sharp and edged with a tension he could no longer disguise, and he stood there for a moment watching me, as if searching my face for answers to questions he had never expected to ask. But the truth was simple. He had crafted a plan against me, and now the plan had turned its gaze back toward him, and he was beginning to understand that the woman he underestimated was not the same woman who once believed his promise. Sat across from me slowly, as if his body weighed more than usual, and for a long moment neither of us spoke, the silence between us stretching like a thread pulled too tight, ready to snap at the slightest tug. And finally he cleared his throat, his voice steady but laced with unease, as he asked if we could truly talk this time as husband and wife. But I had learned by now that his sudden desire for honesty was not born from love or regret, but from fear of losing control, fear of losing access, fear of watching everything he thought he could claim slip through. His hands like sand leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes fixed on mine, and he asked me what was happening, what had changed, what I had done, and he asked it not with anger but with confusion and desperation, because he could not understand how I had moved so quickly, how I had protected myself so completely, how I had become untouchable in ways he never imagined. And I watched him, the man I once believed, in the man I once trusted, and I felt nothing but clarity, because betrayal has a way of cleansing the heart of all illusions, and the woman sitting before him now was stronger than the one he had planned to leave behind. I told him in a calm, steady voice that I knew about the divorce papers, that I knew about the narrative he had crafted, that I knew about his attempts to paint me as unstable and irresponsible, and that I knew he had hoped to take half of everything I owned and walk away without consequence. And as I spoke, I watched the color drain from his face, watched the truth land on him like a weight he could not lift, watched the mask he had held for so long crack beyond repair. And the silence that followed was thick, heavy, and filled with the sound of a man standing at the edge of consequences he never thought he would face. Marcus swallowed hard, trying to regain composure, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him as he said it was all a misunderstanding, a draft, a mistake. something he had not meant to finalize, but I knew his lies too well by then. And his excuses slid off me like water off glass because the truth was simple and sharp. He had intended to leave me. He had intended to take from me, and he had intended to rewrite the story of our marriage in a way that cast him as the hero and me as the problem, but he had not expected me to discover his intent or to act before he could, and that miscalculation was now unraveling everything he valued instead. Of shouting instead of accusing, instead of collapsing into tears, I simply told him that I had taken steps to protect myself, that every asset, every company, every piece of my $500 million fortune was now secured in ways he could never touch, and that any attempt on his part to pursue legal claims would be met with evidence of his deception, evidence he never imagined I would find, and the room grew impossibly still because the power dynamic he had relied on for years had flipped in a way he could not reverse. Leaned back in his chair, eyes unfocused. For a moment, as if trying to process everything, and then slowly, very slowly, anger began to rise in him. Anger not because of the betrayal he committed, but because the betrayal failed, because he could not control the outcome, and he whispered that I had gone too far, that I was being dramatic, that I was creating an unnecessary war. But the truth was that he had fired the first shot long before I ever took a step, and I was no longer willing to stand still and let him aim at meth next hours. Past like the slow unfolding of a storm, Marcus moved through the house with the energy of a man searching for something. He had lost something he believed he still deserved, and he made calls, frantically calls to lawyers, financial advisors, associates. Anyone he thought could help him regain footing, but every call led him into deeper confusion because everything he expected to access was gone, locked behind structures he could not unravel, and every attempt he made only confirmed what he feared. I had taken back the power he once believed I would never claim. That evening he confronted me again, his voice harsher now, his composure slipping as he accused me of scheming, plotting, preparing this for months, and his words came out sharp, like knives thrown in frustration, but I remained calm. I told him the truth, that I had only acted after discovering his betrayal, that my silence had not been plotting, it had been survival, and that every move I made was a response to the choices he had made first, and hearing his own actions reflected back at him left him breathless with anger, because men like Marcus hate mirrors, especially mirrors that show them who they truly. Ari paced the living room, aggressively running his hands through his hair, his movements restless, like a trapped animal, and he said he would fight, he would challenge the structures I created, he would bring everything to court if needed, but I knew his voice was built on fear, because he had more to lose than I did. He had secrets buried in files he thought I would never see, deals made in shadows, debts owed to people who did not take broken promises lightly, and deep down he knew that if he pushed too hard he would expose himself more than May watched him crumble slowly, piece by piece, not because he loved me, not because he regretted what he had done, but because his plan had collapsed and he had no backup strategy. And for the first time since I met him, I saw him for what he truly was, a man held together by image, pride, and the illusion of control, and now every piece of that illusion was slipping through his fingers faster than he could grab it. Next day began with a phone call, a call from someone he did not expect, someone whose tone immediately sharpened his posture, and I knew in that moment that his hidden financial obligations had begun to surface. Obligations it kept from me for years, obligations that now threatened to explode since he no longer had access to what he hoped to take from me. And when he hung up, his hands trembled slightly, and he avoided my eyes because the truth was catching up to him faster than he could run. Left the house for hours, driving to meetings, trying to negotiate, trying to salvage whatever he could, but the world outside was far less forgiving than he expected. And when he returned, his face was pale, his jaw clenched, and for the first time he looked smaller, diminished, as if the weight of his choices had begun to crush him from the inside. At that night, he approached me again, but his tone had changed entirely. Now there was no anger, no charm, no lies, only fear, fear wrapped in desperation, as he asked me to help him, to save him, to give him access to funds, just enough To handle things temporarily, he said, just enough to keep things stable, he said, but I looked at him and saw not a husband in trouble, but a man who had attempted to destroy me and now wanted me to save him from the ruins of his own making. I told him softly that I could not help him, that I would not undo the protections I had built, that I would not place myself back into vulnerability. To rescue a man who had planned to gut my life and walk away clean, and he stared at me with widened eyes, as if he could not believe I would say no, because he had always believed that my love would override my logic, that my loyalty would override my self-respect, that my heart would override my mind. But he was wrong. He had broken the heart he expected to rely on, and now the mind he underestimated was the one standing between him and his survivalists. The days continued. The tension in the house became unbearable. Marcus tried charm, then anger, then guilt, then pleading, but nothing he did could reverse what had already happened, and the truth became clearer with every passing hour. He was drowning, and I was no longer the life raft he had counted on. And soon, something would push him past the point of pretending, past the point of control, past the point of pride, and when that moment arrived, everything we had ever been would collapse in one final, irrevocable breaking point. The breaking point arrived on a quiet gray morning, the kind of morning where the sky hangs low and heavy, as if the world itself is holding its breath, and when I stepped downstairs, I found Marcus sitting in the living room in complete stillness, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together, his gaze locked on the floor, and there was something unsettling in the way he sat, not angry, not frantic, not manipulative, just empty, as if the weight of everything he had tried to escape had finally pinned him to the ground. Looked up slowly when he heard my footsteps, and for the first time since I had known him, his eyes held a kind of honesty not born from sincerity but from the collapse of every wall he had used to hide behind, and he asked me to sit, and though part of me wanted to walk away, part of me wanted the moment to pass without words. I sat because endings deserve clarity, even when they arrive wrapped in pain. Exhaled deeply, his breath shaky, and he said he knew he had lost, that everything he tried to build, yes, even through betrayal, had slipped out of his hands, and he admitted the words he had fought against for so long. He said he had been wrong. He said he had been foolish. He said he had thought he could control everything, even me. And he said it with a slow, broken rhythm, like each confession cracked something further inside him, and for a moment I saw not the man who betrayed me, but the man beneath the layers, the one he had hidden for years behind ambition, pride, and ego. But his honesty came too late. Because honesty given only after collapse is not redemption, it is survival. And I listened in respectful silence, knowing the truth could not undo the damage, knowing his words were not about us. They were about him trying to salvage the last fragments of his dignity. And when he finally fell silent, the quiet around us grew too wide, too heavy, too final. Leaned back against the sofa, covering his face with his hands, and he whispered that he needed help, that he was in deeper trouble than I knew, and that everything was spiraling out of control. And he admitted that the people he owed were not patient people, that promises had been broken, that deadlines were closing in, and that he had counted on securing half of my fortune to escape the consequences bearing down on him. And hearing that truth spoken aloud shattered any remaining illusion I might have held, because he had not just betrayed me, he had tried to use my life as a shield for his own destruction. I stood slowly, feeling a strange calmness wash over me, a calmness that comes only when someone finally reveals the full depth of their deceit. And I told him gently but firmly that I could not help him, that I would not place myself in danger or vulnerability to save him from the fallout of choices he made long before I ever discovered the truth. And he stared at me like I had struck him, because for years he believed that no matter how badly he behaved, I would always choose him, always protect him, always soften for him. But he did not understand that he had already broken the very foundation of that love of ours that followed, unfolded like a slow descent. Marcus moved through The house in a dazed fog, barely speaking, barely reacting, just walking from room to room as if searching for a version of himself he had lost, and every few moments he paused, staring into empty space, and I could feel the panic beneath his silence. Because he was a man who had lived his life through control, and now that control was gone, and there was nothing left for him to grip tightly enough to stop the fall, be the end of the day. His desperation began to show in unpredictable ways. He snapped at small things, slammed doors, paced restlessly, muttered under his breath, argued with people on the phone, and the calm composure he had once perfected cracked in sharp, frightening edges, and by nightfall I knew the storm inside him was turning. Dangerous, not physically, but emotionally, because a man watching his world crumble will fight ghosts even when no one is hurting him. Next morning he approached me again, his posture slumped, his voice worn, as he asked one final time if I would reconsider, if I would give him something, anything, enough to buy time to settle what needed settling, and as he spoke his voice broke in places, revealing the rawness underneath, and for a small moment, a human moment, I felt pity, not love, not forgiveness. Just pity for a man who had built his life on illusions and now had to face the truth of who he was. But pity is not enough to repair what betrayal destroys, and I told him gently that the answer was still no, and that my decision was final, and he froze as if the word no had never been spoken to him with such certainty, and slowly his expression changed. His eyes darkened, his jaw tightened, and the man sitting before me was no longer desperate. He was angry. Angry at me, angry at himself, angry at himself, angry at the world, and in that shift I saw the true storm inside him erupt. Accused me of ruining him, accused me of being heartless, accused me of preparing my escape long before he had even considered divorce, and his words came out like shards of prose, at glass, sharp, reckless, uncontrolled, and I stood there silently letting his anger spill, because every word he shouted revealed who he truly was, a man who believed love should bend to shield him, even when he had planned to walk away and steal half my life with him. But eventually his anger burned itself out, and he sank against the wall, sliding down until he sat on the floor, covering his face again, and for a long moment existed in silence. To people who had once promised forever, now standing on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide, and in that moment I realized something powerful, something liberating. His downfall was not my responsibility. It was the natural consequence of his lies, his greed, his betrayal, and the moment he tried to betray me, he had cut the lifeline he now begged me to throw back to him next day. He left early without saying where he was going, and for the first time in weeks, the house felt open, breathable, and I allowed myself to walk through it without fear, without tension, without the weight of his collapsing world pressing against my chest. And I realized something else. The house itself felt different, as if it had been holding its breath through the chaos and now exhaled years past without him returning, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. Because even though his presence had become heavy, dangerous, unpredictable, the silence of his absence carried its own questions. Questions I knew would be answered soon, but the answer did not come quickly. Instead, it arrived in the form of a phone call late that evening from an unknown number, and when I answered, the voice on the other end spoke with a calmness that chilled me more deeply than any storm Marcus had unlessed it. Voice said my name slowly, deliberately, and then told me something that changed the course of everything that had happened so far, something that shifted the ground beneath my feet once again, something that showed me the story was far from over. Because Marcus was not just in trouble, he was in danger, real danger, and whether I wanted to or not, I was about to be pulled into the final act of a collapse that had been building for far longer than I ever realized. The voice on the phone carried a weight that pressed into my chest before the words even formed, and when the man introduced himself as an officer from a neighboring district, my breath caught in a way I could not fully explain, and he asked if I was the spouse of Marcus Montgomery, and though the title wife no longer felt true to who we had become, I answered yes because the truth still held legal weight, even when emotional ties had long since broken, and the officer spoke slowly with a calm, practiced tone, telling me that Marcus had been found alone in his car on a deserted roadside, his vehicle pulled over near an abandoned service area miles from our home, and he said someone had called in a concern after seeing the car with fucked its hazard lights blinking in the early evening fog. My heart tightened, but not from love, not from panic, but from the sudden understanding that the unraveling he had been spiraling through had reached an inevitable edge. And the officer explained that Marcus was conscious but shaken, incoherent, and deeply distressed, and that emergency responders believed he had experienced a severe panic episode 1, intense enough for him to pull over and remain there for hours until someone finally stopped and called for help. And hearing these words felt like listening to the echo of a life crumbling in slow motion. The final fracture of a man who had spent years building a facade too fragile to withstand the collapse of his own choices. Thea asked if I could come to the station, if I could help them understand his mental state, his situation, his circumstances. And though part of me wanted to refuse, part of me wanted to disconnect completely from his world, that part of me that once believed in vows, in loyalty, in compassion, told me to go. Not for him, not for reconciliation, but because closure requires presence, and I knew this moment would be a final turning point, a moment that would define the rest of my life. Free from him. When I arrived at the station, the lights were dim and the air smelled faintly of old paper and metal, and an officer guided me to a small quiet room where Marcus sat hunched over on a bench, his shoulders slumped, his hands trembling slightly, and when he looked up at me, his eyes were hollow, stripped of pride, stripped of anger, stripped of everything he once used to shield himself from vulnerability. And for the first time in our entire marriage, I saw the real man, not the confident businessman, not the strategist, not the charming partner, but the wounded, frightened human beneath all the layers. Whispered my name, barely audible, his voice cracked, raw and heavy, as if every word hurt to speak. And he said he did not know what happened. He said he had been driving, trying to escape his thoughts, trying to outrun the panic pressing into his ribs, trying to breathe, trying to understand how everything had fallen apart faster than he could grasp. And he said he had pulled over because he genuinely believed he might collapse behind the wheel. And as I listened, I felt something deep inside me shift, not sympathy, not forgiveness, just a calm acceptance of the truth that the man who tried to destroy me had already destroyed himself long before I ever discovered his plan. The officers stepped out, leaving us in silence, and Marcus placed his head in his hands, whispering that he was lost, that he could not see a way out, that everything he had relied on had disappeared, and that he had become a stranger inside his own life. And he said he knew he had done wrong. He knew he had betrayed me. He knew he had tried to take what was not his, but he also said he never expected the consequences to be so swift, so suffocating, so total. And the desperation in his voice pulled at the last thread of humanity inside me. Not as a wife, not as a partner, but as a person witnessing another person at the lowest point of their life. I told him quietly that I did not hate him, that I did not wish for his destruction, but that I could not save him because saving him would mean sacrificing everything. I had rebuilt everything. I had reclaimed every boundary I had learned to protect after years of being overshadowed by his ego and driven by his ambitions. And he looked up at me, searching my face for softness, for weakness, for any sign that the woman he once manipulated might still exist, but she was gone. She had left the moment he chose betrayal over love, and this moment was only her final confirmation. A long stretch of silence, he asked the one question I was waiting for, the question that held the final thread of our marriage. He asked if this was the end, and I looked at him with the calm certainty of a woman who had walked through fire and found new ground, and I said yes, not with hatred, not with anger, not with triumph, but with truth, because endings are not always loud. Sometimes they arrive like a quiet acceptance, a final release of a weight that was never yours to carry. The officers returned and asked if I would be willing to take him home since he was medically stable but emotionally fragile, and though the idea of driving him back into the space we once shared felt heavy, I agreed, because closure requires walking through. The last shadow before stepping fully into the light, and the ride home was silent. Marcus, staring out the window as if the world outside no longer made sense to him. And I drove not as his wife, but as someone delivering the final piece of a chapter that needed to end peacefully. Hey, we reached the house. He stepped out slowly, his movements weary, as if carrying the exhaustion of every poor decision he had ever made, and I stopped him before he reached the door, and I told him gently but firmly that he could stay the night for safety, but tomorrow he needed to leave, not in anger, but in necessity. Because our paths had separated long before this moment, and holding on to something broken would only deepen the fracture left behind, nodded silently, his eyes glistening with an emotion I could not fully name. And we walked inside the house one last time together, to people who once promised forever, now standing at the end of a road that had become too dangerous to walk side by side. And that night he slept in the guest room while I sat awake in the living room, thinking of everything that had happened, the secrets he kept, the choices he made, the plans he crafted, the plans I dismantled, and the strength I found in the wreckage of his betrayal. Morning arrived slowly, with pale light filtering through the curtains, and Marcus came downstairs, carrying a small bag, the kind of bag someone packs when they know they are leaving for more than a night. And he looked at me one last time, eyes filled with regret, fear, and a quiet acceptance, and he whispered, "Thank you, not for staying, not for forgiving, but for not letting him destroy me completely." And for the first time in a long time, his words were honest, without manipulation. Without agenda, without expectation, I walked him to the door and watched as he stepped out into the cool morning air, and with every step he took down the driveway, the past loosened its grip on me, piece by piece, until finally he reached his car and paused one last time, his eyes meeting mine through the distance, and then he left, driving away from the life he once thought he controlled, driving away from the woman he believed he could deceive, driving away from the story he tried to rewrite. At my expensive house fell silent the moment his engine faded into the distance, and I stood in the doorway, inhaling deeply, feeling a wave of calm I had not felt in years, a calm that came from truth, from strength, from reclaiming every part of myself that had been overshadowed, buried, minimized. And I knew then that this was not just the end of a marriage. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a life rebuilt not from fear or betrayal, but from power, clarity, and freedom. The weeks that followed, I finalized the legal separation, secured every part of my fortune, strengthened every boundary I had once blurred, and rebuilt my life with a sense of purpose deeper than anything I had ever known. And though the past left scars, they were no longer wounds, they were marks of strength, reminders of a war one walked through and survived. And when I finally stood in my office, overlooking the city, everything felt new, the world wide open, the future. Mine Alanomy story did not end with loss or destruction. It ended with liberation, with a woman who discovered her own resilience in the silence of betrayal, a woman who reclaimed $500 million and the years of her life that once belonged to a man who never understood her. Worth a woman who walked away, not broken, but reborn. And as I closed the final page of our story, I realized something powerful. Endings are not tragedies. They are beginnings, wearing different clothes, and mine was only just beginning.